Well, actually, the first thing is it was less a question of learning the result than of watching the result unfold, because we were at the ITV studios all night, and we had the projected pollings for each place. So even as early as Newcastle, there was a sense that actually this was not going to go as most people thought. But in terms of how I reacted to the result itself, equivocation and real sort of political science interest, I suppose. I wasn't affected emotionally like a lot of my friends have been by the decision to leave. I'm fairly divided about the referendum myself, and I actually found myself torn between the place where I grew up and the place where I now live. The place where I grew up voted almost 70% leave. The place where I now live voted almost 70% remain, and I felt a degree of empathy with both, I suppose. So it was a relatively sort of unemotional reaction on my part, I'd say. I suppose my personal story regarding Brexit is a weird one in that it's completely and utterly changed my life, because I run a think tank that deals with Brexit. So the referendum, well, we were set up before the general election of 2015, so you can imagine how our lives changed, what were the results of that election that no one expected, the calling of a referendum that wasn't inevitable, the outcome of a referendum that wasn't expected. It's transformed my working life. So this is not a sort of general story. It's specific, I suppose, to people who work on Brexit-related matters. But my life hasn't been the same since the referendum. I'd say two things about the first question, the way I see England. I mean, I've learned a lot about England through my work with the UK and the Changing Europe, because I spent an awful lot of time travelling around the country to places I'd never been before. So I learned a lot. I don't think the outcome of the referendum changed what I thought about England, because I come from a part of the country that voted leave, and I was aware of the fact that there are parts of this country that are dissatisfied, where people are concerned about immigration, where economic performance is lower than in London, and people are very angry about it. So I think what was interesting about the referendum was that it revealed the nature of this country to a lot of people in this country who hadn't realised what this country was like. It's been an important and an interesting learning experience for British people about what Britain is and what Britain thinks. And I do hope, if there's one thing I hope about this referendum, is we address the underlying issues and the underlying anger that partly led to the outcome. In terms of Britain in the world, yes, it will change things, but I mean, it's too hard to say how, because Britain is changing very rapidly and is unpredictable. The world is changing very rapidly and is very unpredictable. But given the combination of Trump, of the rise of China, of new security threats, of climate change, our role in the world is going to have to change, because the world will be very different. But how that's going to take place, I have no earthly clue as yet. One word. I mean, the one word I'd use is complex. Complex in two ways, at least. Complex because Brexit is complex. Leaving the European Union in the 2 years that the treaty stipulates is a massive undertaking, and would be a massive undertaking for any Prime Minister with any majority. It's not all down to Theresa May and her snap election. But complex because this is taking place at a number of levels simultaneously. There are negotiations going on with Brussels, there are negotiations going on in the Cabinet, there are negotiations going on between the government and backbenchers, negotiations going on between Westminster and the devolved authorities. All these things play into each other. So it's a series of moving parts, and for someone who's paid to analyse and explain this, it really can be quite mind-boggling. Wow, that's quite a question. I mean, it's interesting to reflect on the last 100 years, isn't it? I mean, January will be the 100th anniversary of the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles famously placed a huge emphasis on the notion of national self-determination, on the right of nations to have their own state. European integration, in a way, was about blurring that. Brexit, in a sense, was a reaffirmation of that principle. If you watch the Leave campaign, it was about the reassertion of what was variously called control, sovereignty, and so on. And so it's part of an unfolding drama in Europe, isn't it, of trying to figure out how nation states can live together and cooperate together. So it is simply a chapter in a long, long, long story that will continue into the future. Well, that's a really hard question to answer, because we don't know what Brexit will look like, and we don't know how the government will respond to whatever Brexit looks like. So obviously, if we leave the single market and the customs union, it will impact hugely on our trade with the European Union. It will mean that our economy will almost certainly end up being smaller than it would have been had we remained in. And studies show that the areas that voted leave are disproportionately dependent on trade with the European Union. But government can intervene. Government is the mediating factor between shocks to the economy and impacts on real people. So one thing I would expect to see is the government intervening in those areas that will be disproportionately affected by Brexit to do something about it. And unless and until we know what the mixture is of the nature of Brexit and the nature of governmental action to correct those impacts, it's very, very hard to say precisely what will happen. Though I think it's worth stressing because the economic evidence all points in that direction. Leaving the single market and the customs union will almost certainly mean our economy being smaller than it would have been had we stayed. I've thought about getting another passport. I haven't managed it for at least two reasons. One, because if I went to the Irish embassy and claimed to have an Irish grandmother, I think they'd look at me and not believe me, so I haven't wasted my time with that. The second is I could get an Indian passport, and I've always wanted an Indian passport. The problem is the Indians don't allow you to have dual nationality, so I'd have to give up my British passport. So I'm perfectly happy with my British passport for now. And the last thing I'm going to do post-Brexit is flee the country, so I'm relatively happy.